Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. So are we on? Okay. Hello, everybody. Ralph Ogden here from the Australian Water Partnership. I apologize for the delay. My name's often associated with technical delays, but fortunately it wasn't me this time. Welcome to the webinar. This webinar is on international collaboration on water security, and we're very pleased to have in our offices today Dr. Ger Bergkamp from President and CEO of Arcoa. He's formerly the Executive Director of the International Water Association, also had the similar leadership roles in World Water Council and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So we're really pleased to have Ger here to talk about how we can collaborate internationally to give us an idea based on his experience, and I know that'll be of interest to a lot of our partners. So the structure of the webinar is like similar ones that we've done in the past. Ger will talk for a while, up to 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll leave it open for questions. And we might go past 3 o'clock. My apologies again because we've started up late. So take it away, Ger.
Thank you, Rolf. The subject of today is around international cooperation and how can we possibly start to improve generally to actually get a cooperation going. So we are going to look at what is the new context, why would you do it in the first place, how would you actually develop cooperation, and what can be done in a more practical sense. We know that the new situation in the world has changed with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, and with the adoption, including of a goal that is dedicated to water goals, goal number 6, which we all know. But we also have water in many of the other goals, and the meaning that in the other goals. Now we have often say that, but we haven't really looked very much into what does it really mean. So the opportunities arising for not just having a goal that is focused on water, on wash, on wastewater, for example, is there, but looking at what are the other goals. Now let's take an example of goal 6 and 14, where goal 6 looks at wastewater, water quality, and goal 14 also looks at marine pollution. And if you delve a little bit deeper, you see that actually they are very similar kind of goals, slightly different environment, but they're very much linked. So these interlinkages of the goals is not something theoretical, but it actually exists. But it also, and I think that's the important element, it provides opportunities for new kind of work, possibly between new actors that were not collaborating previously with each other. Here, for example, between the freshwater and the marine environment, organizations, companies, NGOs, government departments, etc. And that is new for these goals, that where something of this nature then emerges, it's not always easy. Now, looking a little bit in the depth of what these goals mean, we could easily see that they are super ambitious. They're highly ambitious goals. Let's take, for example, wastewater. If you translate what has been agreed by halving the number of people that are not connected to wastewater treatment, it's about 500,000 people per day between now and 2030 that need to be connected to wastewater treatment of whatever kind and whatever form. This has never been done before. China, over the last 4 or 5 years, has done roughly 95,000 people equivalent connections new per day. And we know that China has gone through a massive operation in terms of wastewater treatment expansion. Just to the river quality improvement that is in the Sustainable Development Goals, it's 600,000 kilometers of river that needs to be restored, dealt with, improved. Again, never done before. In Europe, with the Water Framework Directive, we are at a fraction of that number of kilometers. So the goals are very ambitious, and they also, in that sense, provide a very relevant new context for the work that we're all doing around water. It's an important vehicle. It's a way of communicating between governments, but also with government, that generates certain levels of peer pressure of, are you actually doing anything to realizing the goals? And we have to obviously move beyond speak and actually into action. But it also helps in country prioritization to sort of say, well, what actually do we need to be doing? That's then, of course, discussions at cabinet level, between departments, between ministries. What is important, what is a priority, and what is not. Now, using this, we've seen that it is definitely a high-level framework that is being used with a whole series of intergovernmental meetings associated with it, with review meetings. It helps to set national level priorities for some countries and provides frameworks, but it also increasingly is a reporting framework with the development of some of the indicators to track whether progress is being made. And that whole system is still under development, but it does provide us then with a new context going forward. Another context that we have, of course, is the growing water market globally. We expect to grow the global market from a roughly 600 billion to $1 trillion per year. And if you just give an example of desalination, that will double in the coming 14 years. Growth that is very, but of course, the different regions have different priorities. If you look at North America or China, you compare the two, we've got in North America a lot of refurbishment of infrastructure that needs investments. You've got a lot of issues around water scarcity, where infrastructure solutions are chosen or water market solutions. If I look at Africa, Europe, there's a lot of discussions about the ecological status of the rivers, a lot of debate about reuse with differences between European member states or what they think that it should be or should not be. A lot of emphasis on the water energy nexus, seeing that that energy, of course, is used in water and water is used for energy production. If I look at China, there's a lot of debate, of course, about water quality. We mentioned already the wastewater part. Concepts and practice around sponge cities, sort of like how do you actually work with different approaches to reduce inundations in cities and de facto something along the lines of what we have here in Australia as the water-wise cities, but also still big infrastructure with the big transfers. So if you want to sort of start working internationally, you need to first understand what is this regional context within which places, states, or countries are based. What are government priorities and policies to understand? Would the kinds of things that you want to work on, is there an appetite to engage on these? Because that makes already, you can already see, well, an idea could be dead in the water before you start, because there's just no political interest to move anything on a certain area. So that's a critical step. But finally, it really comes down to understanding national policy and regulatory drivers. If you want to have a business going forward, you need to understand whether there is a real public interest to go forward. And that's because a lot of the actions in water are still public sector dominated activities. And so understanding public policy and where that is going is a key aspect of starting to scope out what international engagement could mean. But I wouldn't say that it is all, because you see increasingly that, of course, industrial water use, and particularly both having the security of access, but also dealing with the effluent in a decent way, is a huge growing opportunity that has often sufficient government, I would say, regulation or policies in place, but it is very much about the effective implementation and enforcement that is then actually, you need to understand where that's moving. Now, increasingly, issues around water that are pretty tough make countries look at partners around the world, internationally and otherwise, to help them being part of the solution. Let me give an example. We have done some work in Jordan recently that is around water scarcity and drought. It started with a global event last year in Brisbane, the World Water Congress. It was linked to work of the United Nations High-Level Panel. A product was produced, the Water Guide, that is a book produced here by either the consultancy company here in Australia. And with that, there is an engagement with the Jordan government and the Australian government to start working on what would it mean to have a number of the actors in Jordan involved, and also Australian actors and others, in trying to address the over-abstraction of about 2 times the sustainable levels in Jordan. So this is a huge, big issue, and of course in a region that is not so stable, to say the least. So to keep stability in Jordan is very much also a geopolitical important matter. But now, how do you actually turn such an opportunity then into a reality, and what would be the mechanisms to use? And that's part what we see as an example of how would you get to a process of engagement that involves, in this case, government, but also private sector, and increasingly a range of actors that could be collaborating on the basis of such a development. Now, what is really then in demand? What kind of demands exist that could be linked to? Now, one key demand is, in a way, is knowledge, and that could be in the form of knowledge transfer through training or education. And obviously, Australia is very well positioned generally in that domain. But it's also access to information or data, or able to manage large quantities of new information and using them for decision making. There's a lot of demand for know-how, which could be problems like over-abstraction, pollution, financing. They're not necessarily technical issues, but they often require interaction with a lot of different actors in very complex and complicated situations. And how do you deal with such situations? That know-how is in high demand. Then there, of course, is always the very, what we call it, straightforward demand for technology, and new technology or applied technology, whether it's on treatment, or non-revenue water, or desalination, or water energy efficiency. That's a huge part. And if you've seen earlier in the graphs that I've shown, a large part of the water global market is actually organized around that kind of technology transfer. A fourth aspect that is in high demand, and that links a little bit to the know-how, what I was just talking about, is the whole aspect of integration. We know that water is, of course, touches upon many aspects of the economy with a lot of different interests. And so how do you mix and match these interests, and how do you reorganize, for example, allocations of water amongst different users and different stakeholders? Or how do you actually develop a much more systemic systems thinking and practice around the water resource and the management systems and governance systems that are related to that? That overall, I would say, complex systems thinking, and how do you translate that into a practice? That is, I would say, is something that is in high demand, but it is not well understood in many places either. So the demand is not necessarily expressed as we need systems thinking, but it is very often expressed more in we don't know how to deal with the complexities of the water management that we currently have or want to evolve. So understanding demand and figuring out where the demand is coming from, so who is in demand, is important. The key part, of course, is understanding also, well, what is Australian, or yourselves as Australian companies and organizations, where are you good at? And not only what you think that you're good at, but actually what is the perception out there of typically Australian expertise that is different. Let me give an example from my country, the Netherlands. I've got two. I will give another one from Switzerland later on. But from the Netherlands is everybody sort of sees, or the Netherlands, there's something about deltas and floods, and that's clearly the Netherlands is not a desert, so yeah, no, drought management is not typically something that the Dutch are known for. So similarly, you see in Australia, there's internationally sort of no doubt that Australia knows something about water scarcity and drought management. But there's also a lot of knowledge perceived to be on water and environmental issues. There's a very strong scientific community, a strong education community. And there's a lot of experiences there has been with water reforms, utility management, evolution of utility management in Australia, and with stakeholder, I call it work, but many aspects of stakeholder engagement and the successes and failures of that. Now, there are other areas where I would say that perception is less there, but there might actually be expertise, know-how, and knowledge well developed, available in Australia. Obviously, this basin management is a classic. There's a lot of mining and water management associated with that. There's well-developed hydrometeorological systems or irrigation modernization. These are aspects that have been developed in Australia, but the perception out there is not necessarily that that's a core competence of Australian actors. So understanding this area is very important because it does help to understand under which umbrella, with which labels, will you be willing to engage internationally with different actors. And I would put forward that at this point in time, there's room for further development of what you could call brand Australia in the water sector. There's definitely some space for clarifying that and communicating this more strategically. Now, we know that going let's look at some data here. This is a report done by the European agency around scientific publications and patents. So the light blue bars in the top graph is the light blue is publications, the ratio between publications and people, and the dark blue bar is the ratio between patents and people. You see, in Australia, there's a lot of scientific publication compared to other countries. And this is water. There's only water. There's all water issues. Australia is really good, a leading country in terms of publications on water issues. But then, if you look at patents, yes, there are quite a few patents, but compared to the number of scientific publications, there's relatively little transfer compared to, if you look at on the right-hand side, Japan, the US, and Europe, of how much scientific research is needed for a patent. So this is very important because it's understanding a bit how innovation, and that's one indicator, how science in a way leads to patents and new products. So in Australia, there is, in that sense, a relatively research needed to get towards innovation. You see that countries like Brazil and China are way ahead and changing rapidly in terms of both publications and patents, where Australia and the US and Europe stay more or less where they are. It's not changing very dramatically. So this understanding of where are we good at? Are we good at innovation? And how does that actually look at? Now, if you look at what we have in Australia, then you see, if you look at the world, Australia should actually be in the top 10. So you have to look at, why is this the case? Why are we not in the top 10? And how do we actually doing on water? Because the costs involved of doing business internationally needs to come from real innovation. So you need to be really good in new things to be able to offer something externally that would match the demand. Of course, we have the CRC centers here in Australia, and well, I would say the jury is out on how effective they are in this space. I would say there are other examples around the world of where mechanisms have been put in place on water or linked to water that would help to accelerate that innovation, and with that innovation going out internationally. And I think it's very important to sort of review, well, what are these mechanisms that are useful? For example, the KIC mechanism in Europe, that's investing billions in startup companies in these key areas, and there's now one potential under development on around water, where there is, as I said, billions available for startup companies in this in such a domain. And then over time, that mechanism should be able to continue to fund itself from the revenue from the investments in the startups in which they have taken equity. So it's a very interesting way of looking at, okay, how do we make innovation happen? And it means that you have to look increasingly, before you can go out, you have to look internally of what are the innovation mechanisms that we have, and how do we actually help innovate so that we can access external markets with some of that innovation. So not innovation in isolation, but innovation very much in collaboration. And so you have to understand better, looking a little bit deeper at the innovation sort of landscape, what are the elements that you need to have to become more innovative? So this is well beyond one company. This is very much looking at, well, how are we collectively creating the innovation environment that we will need to be competitive internationally with some of the new things that we will be developing over the coming years. So it's about, indeed, the institutions, the policy, the political environment, the regulatory environment here. It's about the kind of infrastructure that exists here, how sophisticated some of the work that is here in terms of market mechanisms, but also what are the kind of outputs that are generated from that innovation that would have indeed a usefulness later on as an export product, an export service, or an export relationship. So there's a very important to sort of do the homework at home and in the institutions and companies before you actually are ready to start working further internationally. But then it's about, once you have gone through it, you have to start really looking at what are some of the opportunities and how do you develop these. And you have to find entry points, and entry points are often contacts with other companies, with government at different levels, with people. And so what are the mechanisms to find those new relationships in places? Through the academia, through alumni networks, through trade missions, by the state governments or otherwise. And often attending events could be a very effective and very efficient way of actually starting where you haven't been able to start yet. Often it's a very cost-effective way of doing that, both at events at national level or otherwise. And of course, you need to do some homework to find leads and to find these developing opportunities. Of course, being busy online, obviously, and Google Translate often helps also. And being very much following some of the trade news is essential if you want to sort of develop these opportunities internationally. But I would say the key aspect of all of this is finding a good local partner, where there is a clear shared interest. There must be complementarity, so that is a key aspect. And you need to find the ways to build trust. Trust is something between, obviously not between companies, it's between people, and to see those partners with a clear track record that are willing to cooperate. And that has to be doing on both sides of the equation. And again, it's about, are people willing to cooperate? And this is probably, in my experience, some of the hardest part of actually developing new opportunities is finding these trusted partners that you can start developing a sound relationship with. That's where probably most of the time can be spent. Now let's take an example of such an event. So how do you navigate? We all know these big events, whether it's the World Water Forum or the World Water Congress. How do you navigate such an event where so many people are walking around, and figuring out what do you actually want to achieve through being present in a program or attending a certain session and approach certain people, being present at the trade show and having an appearance, not necessarily individually as a company per se, but if you're smaller, how do you team up with others to actually have a presence? How do you present yourself in different networking events and possibilities? So understanding how this works, and also then how do you work together on addressing these, and you can is important. But you can also come to the conclusion, well, this is not my event. You cannot be everywhere all the time. And you can sort of like, well, nah, the World Water Forum, this is not for me to attend. It's not so important. But I think collectively, that's very important, is that there is a consistent Australian presence in some of those events that actually has to be carried by the partners. And that's a key aspect. What I've seen from some other partnerships around the world is that there is, every time it's not always easy to mobilize the partners, but it is very important to have that presence continuously as Team and Brand Australia in these events, to start mobilizing the interest and create a general environment in which Australian expertise is appreciated. Now, of course, then it's important to sort of understand at what level do you want to engage. We talked about the national, we gave an example of the national level, but very often, of course, business is at a subnational level. That's where business-to-business relationships often sort of have feet on the ground. But understanding then, how do you work with some of the regional or even international organizations in helping you to and supporting you in those endeavors is a very important aspect, and having in that sense support and assistance of understanding how do you can use these mechanisms is critical. Now, of course, we come to the heart of the matter, is sort of like, well, what product or service do we actually then sort of start to work on? It could be education, it could be a collaboration between universities, it could be a collaboration between NGOs or between businesses or between an NGO and a company. But don't assume that the product or service that you have been developing and using in Australia is the one that is the best and matches the demand of what is out there. There's often a huge mismatch between what you think is really needed and what you have to offer, and what is actually the kind of service that in country elsewhere is in demand. And what we often see then is that the business case for such a service is different from what it is in Australia. There might be different actors involved in payment, in compensation, in benefit. And it is really around this creation of a real benefit that I think is the crux of the matter. Because with the rates that you have, and it's of course a lot of developed countries have that challenge, you need to really be able to focus on creating new value out of the corporation, that rather than paying for a service hour per se, or a very specific, discrete element. So that's a whole process to go through in working with the partner on developing and creating that whole approach for creating value added. Now, coming to the end, it's clear that international cooperation has got a lot of opportunity in the coming years, given the increasing size of the market, the political will to work on water issues, both at the government and the corporate level, the number of mechanisms that are increasingly available to support that. But it's also clear that understanding the relationship between what you have to offer and what is the demand and how do you match that is a key aspect of going forward. The second part, what I would say is not going alone is probably the other part what is key. It's finding complementary partners, either that are interested in a certain geography or in a certain complementarity of services that together form more than the sum of the parts. But putting that together, particularly in an environment like in Australia, where the companies are relatively small and can only reach, let's say, the clients in other countries by working together and being smart at it. So that's not, and that's an art in itself. So how do you make effective partners being able to work together to reach out to other countries? And then, of course, it's that relationship building that is a key aspect of coming to any point in time to find that trusted partner. And very often you will need to have some government-to-government relationship established, either mostly formally or otherwise, if the collaboration actually can take off, particularly in Asia, I would say. You need that paving the way, plowing the ground very often for building a relationship between partners. And of course, this is not something that is done in a few months. It takes years, and it also takes years of resources. So that, of course, comes then back like, well, do we have the resources to actually do this? Because you're in here for a while before you will see a financial return on that. And 3 to 5 years is I would say the minimum that you need to count on investing if you think that you would be anywhere of a, well, I would say there is some business flowing, and it is and that's quite a bit of time that you need to spend and effort that you need to put into it. But I can see that therefore seeking support as much as you can from others, both in Australia but also from the partners that you're working in the other countries with, is a key aspect of becoming successful in international cooperation and making this really part of, I would say, the Australia water strategy going forward. So some of the highlights we discussed of what is the new opportunity, why to engage, how to engage, and what are some of the things to take into account when actually developing such a desire of collaborating with partners in other countries and creating some kind of a viable cooperation out of that. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent, Ger. Thanks very much for that. I actually have a question for Shannon. So Shannon, can people actually use audio to ask questions, or do they have to type it in?
No, they need to type into the question thing.
Apologies, it's my first webinar, so that if you would like to ask a question, we've got 7 people here from 4 partners in AWP staff, and then there are 17 online. So if you wish to ask a question of Ger, just please type it in. And we've got one in already from Frederick Buchart, who is asking about the fact that that Ger, you mentioned a local partner, and he was asking a clarification about whether that was local as in country local or local as in another Australian partner. I think you sort of answered that along the way, as it's actually both, but you might want to answer.
Yeah, and I think the question is, depending on what you want to do, you might want to find a Australian partner that is complementary to what you are doing, to create something that matches a demand outside, which you wouldn't need to do maybe in Australia. So that's one way where you might want to find, for example, you've got a a specific technology product, but you don't have the extension or marketing services. Well, there's a possibility maybe to partner up with an Australian company to do something that would be marketing in a Chinese environment. Well, that's a kind of partnering that you could think of. Then, of course, to me, really the key aspect is finding local partners to work with, and that's in-country partners, and that's takes time to find the right partners. It's about people, it's about track record of company, but it's also about the magic click. Can you work together? Is there some magic emerging from that collaboration? And that's not only business time, but it's also downtime, often with colleagues, to get to know each other and build that trust. And having some bad experiences with people and surviving these is sometimes a very good way to build trust. So trust is not only happiness, trust comes also from having bad moments, or having bad moments with a third party together is also a great way of building trust with partners in other countries. Because you have to realize that cultural barriers and language barriers do exist, and that's another element to take into account. The great thing, of course, is that in Australia you've got a very multicultural community, and there's ample opportunity to use that to your advantage in the engagement, particularly in the Asian region, I would say.
Great. I actually have a follow-up question to that. So I guess it implies in this that in your experience, most of the work that's being done overseas is through collaborations between groups rather than a consultancy or any other group working individually with an international partner.
What I see at the moment, of course, in the Australian situation, is that it's very scattered. It's very much individual actors being here, being there, but there's very little collective appearance and creating value add by that collective appearance. And I think there's probably quite a bit of mileage to gain by thinking through what that would mean for an Australian way of doing that.
Right. And do other countries tend to work collaboratively? I mean, in other words, take a collaborative team? Does the Netherlands tend to take collaborative teams to tackle problems overseas?
Yeah, so for example, you have, just give an example, if you ask the Netherlands, there's a very close cooperation offer between the dredging companies and some of the IT remote sensing modeling companies, because for precision dredging, you need that new IT, these new approaches. Well, that actually, because you can be then competitive in a market where, for example, Chinese dredges are much cheaper to dredge, but they just dredge everything, so to say, rather than precision dredging.
Right.
So as an example of what would then that collaboration in country with your own home country,
right,
could that mean for a value added or winning tenders finally in other countries?
Okay. We've got two questions coming online, and I'll let maybe the room ask the questions. So the first one's from Basant Maheshwari. Thanks for your presentation. Water security is quite complex, and it's not a technical fix. What are your thoughts about transdisciplinary approach to water security?
Thank you, Basant. I think your point is absolutely well taken. I think there's definitely technical matters, of course, in water management, but part of the complexity very much comes from needing to work across many disciplines. And I can see that the practice of that is, I would say, scattered, to say the least, around the world. I think what Australia has probably to offer is developing and I would say codifying or synthesizing some of the experiences in Australia and elsewhere on dealing with that complexity. And I gave one example around Water Guide as an example of such an effort to synthesize and bring different strands together. And I'm sure there are other approaches that are still there, building on the Australian experience. For example, we talked about irrigation reform, irrigation efficiency. That's not only technology only, that's a lot of institutional and behavioral change that needs to happen if you want to get your agriculture into the 21st century.
Great. Rob Vertesi asks or says, many Australian water businesses are hesitant to engage in international activity because the upfront cost of engagement and the long payback period for the investment. What do you think we could do to address this hesitancy?
Yeah, Rob, that's a very good question, because that is part of the reason why small companies often haven't got the firepower to actually even start, let alone do the 3 or 5 year engagement before some of the business would become, let's say, your return on investment becomes positive, so to say. I think there are a number of activities that can be done collectively, which is, for example, if every company needs to analyze every market again, that's a lot of work and double work. You don't need to do that every time again. Indonesia water market is, you can do one report on the Indonesia water market specifically for areas of interest, for example, to Australian partners, and sort of say, well, that's roughly the opportunity here. These are roughly some of the challenges and hurdles and mechanisms to be used. And hey, this is a group, and then out of that is a group of Australian actors that are interested in the geography Indonesia. They start to come together. The report could be a starting point for that, and it becomes easier because you actually all reduce that element of upfront cost. So, and then along the creation path, you can find other mechanisms that countries have developed to indeed make it easier, particularly for small and medium enterprises to further develop that. The other key element, I would say, you didn't touch it in your question, is of course the risk associated with doing business elsewhere. And I think there is also where the Australian government has a role to play, of how do you deal and what can you do as a government or a government-to-government relationship in dealing with maybe part of that risk, not all, but part of these risks. And other countries have set up mechanisms to basically cover up to 50, 60, 70% of that risk through particular mechanisms. And I think that's another area of further development, I would say.
So are you talking about MOUs, government to government MOUs usually, or what are the?
Yeah, it could also be loan guarantees. It could be payment mechanisms. Yeah. So there I can see is there's a whole, along that, again, creation phase, there are different moments on time where different government to government, I would call it air cover or support or enabling conditions would make it easier for companies and reduce some of that, the transaction cost of getting to collaboration.
Okay, great. Question from the room? Any questions from the room?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ger. Will Vargas speaking. Just picking up on a comment, you said that there, in your view, could be scope for greater organisation around the narrative of Team Australia. Just wondering whether you might expand on that from your perspective or observation internationally.
How Team Australia can be strengthened, you mean?
Yeah, just I was interested to hear your comment to say that you think there is scope for improving the narrative or the presentation of Team Australia. Do you have views that might expand on that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Will. I think the Team Australia is something, in my view, that has to come from the heart in a way. It has to be the partners, the companies, the people that want to appear together as being together. And of course, what I have seen in other countries, by starting to organize for going internationally, it helps strengthening a bit of the coherence in country, because suddenly you're confronted with the well, either Netherlands or non-Swiss or non-French or non-Portuguese, and wow, actually, yes, we actually need to come together to actually find new opportunities together, because alone we won't get there. So I can see that by strengthening that collaboration, there's also an opportunity to change some things within Australia. And that's a very interesting other dynamic that you can sort of see, well, as part of the new national water strategy needs to be written. I think it's time for that. Well, why don't you add an international component to that? That's what happened, for example, in the Netherlands, where national water strategy was not only dams and dikes, it was also how do we actually develop the sector so that it becomes internationally competitive and is able to go out as a sector to engage more broadly than beyond the boundaries of the country, rather than say this is only a foreign affairs issue.
Okay. Right. Pablo Orems says, I found it challenging to maintain the momentum generated from an initial face-to-face engagement with international counterparts. There can be clear opportunities and interest from potential clients, but during the follow-up stage, interest usually decreases or disappears. Would you recommend any engagement strategies to maintain the flame alive?
Well, I think we all know that that challenge, Pablo. So it's good meeting and sort of like, yes, interesting, and then what's next? And then nothing happens. And so, to me, it's one of the things is key is this at the end of for example, a meeting or a mission or an encounter to have some very simple, easy to do follow-up steps. So it's not like a big plan that comes out of the discussion that will be on the horizon maybe, but something very simple and concrete. So the emphasis is on starting to walk together rather than having a grandiose plan, and that I think is often a mistake of we have a very big idea, but we haven't been able to learn to walk yet. The other part, what is potentially interesting, is starting to use, and that's why partnership is interesting. Who can you come be there if you're slightly larger, or how can you organize a follow-up visit so that it's a follow-up call, it could be a follow-up visit, or it could be a follow-up invitation, so that you start having to have a pattern of regular interaction that is a bit codified, or this is how we do it, because it's first of all that interaction rather than immediately creating a contract or a business. That is probably the key aspect in that early stage. In that early stage could easily be 12, 18, 24 months. That's easy, that you need to keep that momentum.
Right. Uday Nidamolu, and I apologize if I butchered your name. There is renewed emphasis on supply side of river water, focusing on rejuvenating rivers, and seems to have support from the public as well as policy. Often we're focused on the demand side. Would this open up new opportunities? New emphasis on supply side of river.
Uday, thank you for your question. So you, if I interpret your question correctly, you ask, we are focused in Australia a lot on demand management, so efficiency, etc. But there is internationally there is still a lot of interest in supply, in managing the resource in that sense, and how do you do that part? And I would sort of say that depending a bit on where you are, there is still, in this case, water resource development to do. If for my work in Africa, I can clearly see there's still a huge opportunity to work on, for example, water storage. The amount of water storage in Africa is still so low that you cannot meaningfully really manage a very fluctuating resource availability. So that's what, of course, we have done in Australia and in many other places. But I think the final approach is really a portfolio of both supply and demand options. It's that mix and that portfolio approach that is probably the best way forward in most occasions. So it's and efficiency and looking at smarter supply options.
Great. Okay. Any other questions from the room?
Yep.
Simon? Yep.
Simon Tilliard from Alluvium, and this question sort of launched a bit of Will's. When you talk about the need for brand Australia and cooperation between academia, the private sector, government, you could add NGOs in there, and there's a longer term payoff in terms of forming a brand Australia, but that takes time. What do you suggest in terms of incentives to try and get people sharing and collaborating in the shorter term?
Yeah, I would, in my view, everything has started small. So to my feeling, it would be focus on one or two countries where you would get a specific group of actors together that are interested in that geography, and start then looking at, okay, well, how do we gonna work together to come up with new offerings or new analysis or synthesis or relationships, new connections, sharing some of the information. That might be a very practical, low cost, low effort way to start organizing Team Australia in this case in relation to a specific geography. And I wouldn't start with the big countries, I would start with a smaller country. That could be one way of looking at it. The other part I would say is taking one, two, or three areas and say, well, how do you, well, start with one. How would we build a sub-partnership or a coalition of the willing that have complementary skill sets and things to offer to deliver a more complicated package? If you, for example, look at the water guide, for example, that is a bit of a framework, and we can use more of those frameworks in my view. With that, there are areas of work where you need specific competencies, expertise, knowledge, know-how, software that is partly available in Australia. Well, let's use some of that as an organizing framework for having new coalitions that actually could work together on delivering some of that. So these are two approaches in a way. One is more on a complexer issues that is part of what is in demand to have that, as I mentioned in my presentation, and what I think is a competence that is available in Australia, but actually putting it then together, that still has never really been done. So there's an opportunity there, I would say.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question in relation to that. So I guess I sort of have two approaches in my mind. One is that you have, like you've described, a sort of a Team Australia approach around a problem, a set of organizations that think they can put together an offer, combined offer that has value. So it's essentially a solution looking for countries with problems that correspond to the solution. And the other is going out and engaging what the demand is and trying to characterize the demand and then responding to the demand. I know they're not exclusive, mutually exclusive, but in your experience, does sort of coming up with a solution and going to the market work on its own, or do you really have to be spending a lot of time gauging demand and really trying to work with the countries to understand the demand?
In my view, the demand, you need to put some effort in it, but I think that you can do this relatively quickly.
Right.
It's not
through these market analyses.
The analysis, yeah. the relationship that already existing, both at government but also at business and NGO level. Right. There's a lot of, you won't go to Paraguay as the first country to sort of do that for, so to say. Let's be clear. So, but there's on a lot of countries there is already a lot of knowledge on what is the demand there, but then actually sitting down with a group that is focused on that geography. How are we going to deal with these right. sorts of demands? What are we going to do as Team Australia across different organizations? Right. That's part of, I would say, is the fascinating challenge to be dealing with. It's really exciting, I would say.
Yeah. Tony?
Tony Slatcher here. Ger, how do you think we should, well, not just us, but I guess this is a common issue, but you know, every firm has its competitive instincts and needs and drivers. So in the natural course of things, if we're very successful at a particular body of work, there'll be several Australian firms that would be chasing that work. And are you suggesting that Team Australia is sort of code for trying to organise all that in such a way that there's just one preferred provider, or there's some internal process to figure out who should be the front company for a particular activity, or are you feeling that it's more just that any Australian presence, whether it's through one or many businesses, should sort of collectively adhere to a basic Team Australia spirit? It's a very real issue because we have, you know, in some countries we have many Australian firms out working essentially in the same space, and you know, that's a good thing for those firms and for the in all sorts of ways that's a good thing, but it's not totally compatible with the sort of idea of trying to everybody be organised so that we're going in with a single sort of message or a single look and feel. So I'm just interested in how you think about that tension, because I know it's the same with Netherlands and Denmark and other. All the serious players will have multiple capabilities in those areas, and it's not just a case of putting forward one business and saying this is the Team Australia lead business.
No, and I'm totally on your page. So I think from any tender or contracting part where the business is, it's upstream of creating an environment in which the Australian expertise and knowledge is known, is branded, or like, well, therefore you would be going to look in the Australian camp, so to say. And sometimes it's a subject area, sometimes it's an approach around governance or for example, water markets. Well, there's been a bit of experience in Australia with that. Well, that typically would be something to sort of say, well, go to Russia for that. So to my sense, it's upstream from where the business happens, and then of course there are government tenders to which either one company or a coalition from companies can respond and they can compete. And I think it's a bit about the moment that you're in that tender competition mode. Yes, of course, you've got your tender group and or your very specific coalition or not that actually is working on that, but it doesn't prohibit companies upstream to sort of say, well, we want to be working with other partners. Some companies, and that's why we shouldn't emphasize that, don't want to be branded with Australia. We're an international company. We don't want to be. We want to have more offices around the world. And we originally maybe we started in Australia, but now we have 20 offices with 5 people each, and we're not an Australian company, and that's fine too. That's what you have also in Europe, of course, a lot. So there's different horses for different courses in that sense. But I think for a general interest, I think having a bit of a more clearly expressed identity of Australian water know-how, expertise, technology approach, that can't do any harm, I would say.
Righto, Ger, I think we're just on an hour now, and so I think we'll wrap up. But thank you very much for that. That was really interesting, and I certainly learned a few things and have a few takeaway messages for how AWP might sort of support some of this, particularly obviously the Team Australia approach, and possibly the market reports, country analyses type things, where we can maybe facilitate getting that out to the partners. So a few ideas for us to take away as well as our partners, hopefully. So Thank you very much, Ger, and best of luck for the rest of your trip.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for all being with us together, and good luck.